So we've talked about Spain, which is basically run by the Habsburg family. We've talked about England, that's going to be run by the Tudor family in the 1500s and the Stuart family in the 1600s. And we'll talk about the Stuarts more probably later on this week. But that won't, the Stuarts, James I is the only Stuart that's going to be on your test next week. And then we are going to, and then France, we talked about the Valois family that's going to be replaced by the Bourbon family. And then we talked about the Habsburgs of Austria and the Hohenzollern family of Prussia. Now we're moving on to Russia. Not Prussia. Prussia is considered the German state. Russia, of course, is the Russian state. Anyway, the Romanov family is going to take over Russia. And that happens in the 1600s. All right, but let me give you a little history of Russia first. Okay, so Russia is a mixture of both European culture and also Asian culture. So you have a mixed blend of that in Russia. A lot of that has to do with the Mongols, especially Genghis Khan. He takes over Russia, and the Khans take over Russia. And they rule Russia from roughly the 1200s to the 1500s. And it's Ivan the Terrible that actually breaks, or it's his family that breaks away from the Mongol rule. I think it's actually Ivan the Terrible himself. So basically, from the 1200s to the early 1700s, Russia is isolated from Western Europe. Yeah, it developed some culture. We can go back a little bit further. As a matter of fact, the Russians are actually Orthodox. That's their religion. They're not Catholic. So when they had the split in 1054, Russia is going to go east rather than west. So I don't know if you remember, but the church in 1054, you had the Great Schism where the Pope represented, excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope. So there was a split in 1054, and they slowly tried to get that back, but that never happened. Matter of fact, it wasn't until the 1960s that they actually lifted the excommunication of both the Pope and the Byzantine, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, lifted the excommunication on both of them. So anyway, so Russia's different than the West. One way, it's a mixture of Asia, and that's because of the Mongol conquest. Second reason is the Eastern Orthodox Church, and also the third reason is because of the Byzantine Empire. When Rome falls in the West, the Byzantine Empire keeps going all the way to 1453. Once Constantinople falls, Russia or Moscow is considered the third Rome. To them, they're considered the third Rome. Okay, so it goes from Rome to Constantinople to Moscow. Okay, so you have all this different mixture of things that makes it a little different than most European countries. And going back to the Mongols, it's the Tsar, which actually the word Tsar comes from the word Caesar. So that's a derivative of Caesar, Tsar and Caesar. The Germans have it too, by the way. The Germans will call their king Kaiser. So that's the correct in Latin. The correct pronunciation for Caesar is Kaiser, because there's not soft C's in Latin. Anyway, I just went on a rabbit hole there. But so just to let you know, okay, the Tsar is going to be heavily influenced by Mongol rule because the Tsar is considered all-powerful and the church is subservient to the Tsar. It's a little different in the West. That there's a struggle between church and the political forces In Russia, there is no force. The Tsar is control of both the state and the church. Okay? So for example, the nobility in the West had a say in the government, all right, or would rise up in rebellion. Okay? The established church, the Catholic Church, would put a check on the king's power, the monarchy. This is all in the West, right? So this is England, France, the German states, Spain. So the nobility had a check on the king or the monarchy. The church had a check on the monarchy. The towns that got granted royal charters would be a check, which have a lot of your middle class, which we in French call bourgeoisie, would have a check on the king. Okay, so all those things in the West would oppose absolute royal power. All right. So for example, when Louis XIV says, "Laissez-moi moi," I am the state, that's me. He still had checks on him: the nobility, the Catholic Church, the towns, the different regions in his area that had different customs. So he wasn't absolute. That is not in Russia. The Tsar is going to have absolute control over the church, the towns, the government, whatever. And the reason why, well, at least I would argue, the reason why that happens is because of how the Mongols rule. Once the Tsars overthrow the Mongols, they're just gonna replace the Mongols. But there is one check, and that's their Christian faith. Okay. So let's talk about Ivan IV of Iron the Terrible. Okay. So one of the most powerful early Tsars is this man, Ivan the Terrible, who's going to rule Russia from 1533 to 1584. And I believe he's the man that actually eventually breaks off from the Mongols, from the Khans. The Khans, well, Genghis Khan takes over the area, okay? And then after a while, though, they start to lose control, and they allow the Tsars to run the show in their name. And eventually, I believe Ivan the Terrible is the one that actually breaks off and runs his own kingdom in Muscovy, which is now what we call Moscow. Okay? Now, when Ivan, this is going to be a familiar story, when Ivan becomes Tsar at the age of 3, he's caught between rival groups of nobles that are trying to run the country, right, in his name. And so it's very important, okay? These rival people are going to slaughter each other in front of Ivan. That's going to have a major impact on Ivan's life. Same thing happened to Peter the Great too. Same thing happened to Louis XIV too. Okay, so as an adult, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, and I'll tell you why he's Ivan the Terrible in a second. Ivan the Terrible saw treason everywhere. So he'd arrest people, he would exile people, he would execute people. Okay? Even some of his closest advisors were executed. Okay? So the reason why he's known as Ivan the Terrible is because in a fit of rage, I forget exactly what his son does, but I'm not sure if it was a bad report or something, but he kills him by beating him with a rod, like a poker from a fireplace. He just beats him until he's bleeding and he dies. And because of that, he obviously regrets it, but he lives in this shadowy world where he's afraid everyone's going to betray him. As a matter of fact, I believe that he would never walk into a place where he couldn't see the back. Like, he'd make sure that mirrors are around him so that he could see what was going on in the back. That's how paranoid he was. Okay? So when he ruled, he wanted to make sure that there was no threats to his kingdom, and so he would limit the power of the nobility, which you call the boyars. Right? So he was afraid they'd try to overthrow him. So he was, like I said earlier, you'd either execute them, exile them, or put them in prison. Okay? And he put all the lands of Muscovy under his direct control. And to force this, he he'd sent out his secret police. It's called the Obneki, okay, which would terrorize the rest of the country. Side of Oponeki is I would argue, I mean, I shouldn't say this. Well, I have a theory that the Obneki, you can see if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, the ring rafts. I think Tolkien took the ring rafts idea from the Obneki, how Ivan the Terrible was the secret police, because with it that the Obneki would wear black hoods, and they would have dog skulls on the back of the horses. They rode black horses, and you could hear the dog skulls clanging together when they were coming, to basically terrorize the people, be afraid of them. So anyway, that's all Ivan the Terrible. To enforce his rule, he'd scare them. Okay? When he dies in 1584, Russia drifts in chaos. And it's known as basically the time of troubles. Okay? So from 1598 1613, you have this time of trouble, people kind of controlling, trying to gain control over Muscovy, or what we now call Russia. So you have nobles fighting each other over the throne. You have pretenders, like, for example, I believe someone pretended to be Ivan the Terrible's son, says, I'm back, here I am, I'm the real Tsar. So you have all this going on, plus you have foreign invaders invading Russia. At this time, just to let you know, Poland and Lithuania are very strong kingdoms, not like they are today. And they would invade the areas of Russia. Okay. Anyway, to end this time of troubles, the nobles got together, the clergymen got together, the townspeople got together, and they finally decided to name Michael Romanov as Tsar in 1613. This starts the Romanov dynasty, which lasts from 1613 to 1917, when you had the Russian Revolution. So eventually, the Romanov family is going to be executed by the communists. So, but it's roughly a 300-year span of Romanov dynastic power that's going to be displayed in Russia. And by the way, that's a picture of Michael Romanov, who starts the Romanov dynasty. Okay, so the Romanovs are going to make some changes in society. Okay, first, one of the changes are the boyar. When I say changes, they're basically limiting the power of all these different places that gain power during the times of trouble. So, for example, the boyars are going to be tied to the Tsar's service. Townspeople are going to lose their influence. Peasants being virtually enslaved. The workforce, like they're serfs, they're tied to the land. Okay, so this happens on the Romanov because they want order, and so they don't want another time of trouble. So the Romanovs are going to limit the power of the nobility, which we call boyars, limit the power of the townspeople, and tie the peasants, which we call serfs, to the land. Okay? Now, in the Ukraine, which is the southwest portion, well, it's actually broken away now, but the southwest portion of Russia, okay, you have some self-governing villages that are run, and they're known as the Cossacks. Okay, the Tsar is going to use the Cossacks for his own shock troops. So the Cossacks are some peasants. They're going to be famous, and eventually, what's going to happen is, well, I guess I'll wait on the Communist Revolution. Okay, but the Cossacks are a powerful force in the Ukraine. So just to let you know, you have vast stretches of Russia that's slowly being taken over by the Tsar. One of those places is Siberia. Okay, so peasants, traders, and adventurers are going to move into Siberia. So Tsar is going to claim that area for Russia as well. So you have a slowly increase of Russia land. So just to let you know, it starts off around Muscovy or Moscow, and it slowly builds. And we'll talk about the land grabs of Russia, because this man right here, Peter the Great, is going to make one of the major land grabs of Russia. Okay? So again, Peter the Great is going to be a Romanov. He's going to rule Russia from 1689 to 1725. And he is known as Peter the Great because he's going to westernize Russia. That is what he's famous for. It's westernize Russia. As a matter of fact, he's going to take a tour of the West. He's going to go to the Netherlands. He's going to go to England. He's going to go to France. And he's going to make this grand tour to see how Western civilizations work. And he's going to bring those ideas to Russia. He especially, when he was tutored, he loved to go sailing. So he wanted to bring the sea trade to Russia. Right? Now, when he went on that tour, though, he's about 7 feet tall, and he's supposed to be incognito, but it's kind of hard to be incognito when you're 7 feet tall. But that's one of his major strengths, is to that's one of his major goals, is to westernize Russia. Right? Now, when he was a boy, when he took the throne, okay, the same thing that happened to Ivan the Terrible, the same thing that happened to Louis XIV when their children, Peter the Great was in the Kremlin, and he saw firsthand what the boyars were doing to each other. They were murdering each other so that they could gain access to Peter the Great. And he saw this with his mother and his own eyes. So he fears, and he's very hesitant to trust the nobility of Russia. Okay? So, so when he takes that trip, it's an 18-month trip, and because he wants to educate the Russians, he wants to westernize the Russians, because of this tutor, there's an outside world that's different than Russia, right? And he felt that most Russians were illiterate peasants, and only a few of the nobles were educated. And so he wants to change that. So he takes this 18-month study tour, visits shipyards, factories, mills, laboratories, and he wants to bring all that stuff back to Russia. And he wants to bring some people with him to help him westernize Russia. Okay? So when he comes back, he's going to force the nobility to adapt Western lifestyles. So, for example, the boyars, the nobility, will have these long beards. He wants them cut. He wants them to dress like Louis XIV has his nobles dress at Versailles. Now, there's one problem with that. Okay, the Russian nobility wears these fur coats, right? And Peter the Great wants them to dress like the people at Versailles, but it's very cold in Russia, so that might cause some problems. So that's the reason why the Russian nobility has the beards, have the coats, because of the harsh winters of Russia. Okay? But anyway, he launches the initiative to change the boyars, the nobility, to Western ways. He's also going to launch an education initiative to teach the Russian people so that they can all be westernized. In addition to that, he's going to move his capital. Sound familiar? He's going to move his capital from Muscovy, Moscow, to St. Petersburg. Okay? And that's off of the Baltic Sea. So it's going to be what he calls the window to the west. So he's going to move his capital that's in the center of Moscow to St. Petersburg, and he's going to develop a city. It's actually kind of a wetland, if you will, like kind of a swamp area, right? But he's going to conquer that area. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And he's going to build his capital there, right? And his goal is to westernize Russia so that it can become a European power. So he's going to expand Russia's borders south, east, and northwest. And he does that in this war called the Great Northern War against Sweden. Sweden owns that area. Okay? So if you look, this is the area that they're fighting in this what we call the Great Northern War. Okay, so for foreign policy, just to let you know, Russia is isolated, and so in order to develop trade, they need a warm water port. That is going to be the major foundation for Russia foreign policy. They're going to try to get and find a seaport that's warm. Okay? Because if you notice, most of the seaports that Russia has are frozen roughly 8 months out of the year. Okay? So their goal is to get a warm water port. What Peter the Great does is take the land where we now have St. Petersburg. Okay? So because of this, Peter is going to modernize and he's going to go to war with Sweden, and it pays off. They actually defeat Sweden in the Great Northern War in 1721, and he wins control over the Baltic region. But the Baltic region is frozen, right? But that's a start, right? It's the start of him getting a warm water port, and he builds his capital at St. Petersburg. So, borrowing ideas from France, he introduces a central bureaucracy and places the local government under the bureaucracy control. He brings the Eastern Orthodox Church under his direct control. How he does that is he creates the Holy Synod, which is a council of bishops responsible to him and the government. Okay, so he is gaining all this power. He's using this power to modernize Russia militarily, culturally, economically. Okay, and he also creates a new class of nobles called the Dovine, who are going to return for government service and which are allowed to own land. Okay, and he just like Frederick the Great Elector, he's going to make a deal with these nobles that they can have full control over the peasants on the land, which we call serfs. Okay, in exchange for absolute power in Russia. He also, to make government more efficient, he changes the tax laws. And of course, it's the poor that's going to pay the taxes, not the nobility. And the reason why is because he makes the same deal that Frederick William the Great Elector of Prussia does. He wants to modernize Russia. He wants to rebuild his military. He wants to rebuild the economy. He wants to move his capital to St. Petersburg. This costs a lot of money. Okay? So he's going to allow a lot of power. So the nobles are going to give him this power in exchange for no taxation on them. Okay. In addition, his domestic policies are going to make the Eastern Orthodox Church under his control. So this whole idea of Peter the Great making changes, what I want you to really focus on, what you remember about Peter the Great, is that he's going to be heavy-handed in making Russia westernized. That's his goal, right? And a lot of these goals, he's going to suppress the powers of the nobility, suppress the powers of the towns, suppress the powers of the church, to make him the head of the country. Okay? And he's doing this. He's making this haste because he wants to rush Russia into Westernization, right? Because he wants to be a great power in Europe. All right. So this little map right here shows the growth of Moscow or Russia. Right. So if you look, this is what Moscow looked before Ivan III. So the purple. Then if you look at the orange, that's at the death. So in 1505, you have Ivan III. Okay, so you see a growth close to Finland, and then growth on the White Sea right there. So that's all a growth of Moscow, Muscovy. And then you see Ivan the Terrible with the green. Okay, and then you see Peter the Great gain Ukraine, Lithuania. He builds his capital, St. Petersburg. That's his gain. And then, if you look, you have at Catherine the Great or Catherine II, the yellow, which that's what they really wanted. It was a warm water port in the Crimean. Now, if you know that, I don't know if you know, but that's where the Ottomans are. Okay, so there's going to be a conflict between the Ottomans and Russia, and it's going to eventually turn into a conflict between the Austrians, the Russians, and the Ottomans. So, but let's stop here, and we'll talk about Catherine the Great tomorrow. Are there any questions?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll stop here, and then we'll finish up Russia with Catherine the Great, and maybe we'll go to the Stuarts as well tomorrow. Okay. All right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.